Christina had always believed that kindness was the only currency that truly mattered. But on that gray Chicago morning, as she stood in the marble foyer of the Sterling mansion, watching the man who employed her mock his own mother, she realized that some people were bankrupt in ways money could never fix. The silence that followed his cruel words felt like winter settling into her bones. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're folding clothes in a quiet room, stirring a pot in a kitchenette, or coming home after a long shift, your body aching and your heart heavy. It doesn't matter the hour, the city, or the weight on your shoulders. But today's story will surprise you, and maybe, just maybe, it will linger long after you hear it. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the Sterling penthouse, casting long shadows across floors so pristine they reflected the Chicago skyline like a mirror. Christina Martinez moved through these halls with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible, her worn sneakers silent against the imported marble. At 62, her hands bore the evidence of a lifetime spent caring for others, weathered from years of scrubbing, cleaning, and mending the broken pieces of wealthy families who barely knew her name. She had arrived at the Sterling residence 6 months ago, taking the job not out of choice, but necessity. Her small apartment in Pilsen, with its cheerful yellow walls and the scent of her neighbor's pozole drifting through thin walls, felt like a world away from this cold fortress of glass and steel. The commute alone was an hour each way on the CTA, the blue line carrying her from the warmth of her community to the sterile perfection of the Gold Coast, where Michael Sterling had built his empire. Michael Sterling. The name commanded respect in Chicago's financial district, where his investment firm managed portfolios worth billions of dollars. His cryptocurrency ventures alone had generated enough profit to buy entire city blocks. His stock market acumen legendary among the wealthy elite who moved through his circles like planets orbiting a distant sun. But Christina saw what the financial magazines and society pages missed. A man so hollow that his vast fortune could not fill the emptiness that echoed through his 30-room penthouse. The mansion itself was a testament to wealth accumulated without wisdom. Persian rugs worth more than most people's annual salaries lay beneath furniture imported from Italian craftsmen who charged 6 figures for a single dining table. The kitchen boasted appliances that cost more than luxury cars, their surfaces gleaming and untouched, as cold as the man who owned them. Every room whispered of money. Old money, new money, cryptocurrency fortunes, and investment portfolios that generated passive income while people slept. Yet for all its opulence, the house felt like a mausoleum, beautiful and lifeless. Christina understood loss in ways that Michael Sterling, for all his billions, could not comprehend. She had buried her husband Roberto 3 years ago, watching cancer steal him away piece by piece while she worked double shifts to pay for treatments their insurance wouldn't cover. The medical bills had consumed their modest savings, forcing her to sell their little house in back of the yards, the one Roberto had painted blue because it reminded her of the sky over her childhood home in Guanajuato. Now she lived alone in a studio apartment, surrounded by photographs of a life that once felt full and rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. But Christina carried her grief like she carried everything else, with quiet dignity and an unshakable faith that kindness would always matter more than capital gains or cryptocurrency portfolios. She had seen enough wealthy families over the years to know that money was often just another hiding place, another wall built to keep authentic human connection at bay. The Sterling family was no different, perhaps even worse, in their isolation from anything resembling genuine warmth. This particular morning, as Christina arranged fresh flowers in the main hallway, flowers she had bought with her own money because no one else bothered, she heard voices coming from Michael's study. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see him standing behind his mahogany desk, its surface covered with financial documents, stock reports, and a laptop displaying cryptocurrency exchange rates that fluctuated like a heartbeat monitor. Michael was speaking to someone, his voice carrying the cold authority that had built his fortune but destroyed his family. "Listen carefully," he said to the young man standing nervously before him, gripping a resume like a lifeline. "I need someone who understands priorities. This household runs on efficiency, not sentiment. If you're going to work here, you need to understand that some people are simply expendable." Christina's hand stilled on the flower stems. She had heard variations of this speech before, the casual cruelty that wealthy people sometimes displayed when they thought no one was listening. But what came next made her blood run cold. "That woman who cleans the floors," Michael continued, his tone as dismissive as if he were discussing yesterday's newspaper. "She's getting too comfortable, too familiar. Yesterday I caught her humming while she worked, acting like she belongs here. If you see her trying to engage with my family, trying to insert herself into conversations where she doesn't belong, I want to know about it. I won't tolerate the help for getting their place." The young man shifted uncomfortably, but nodded. "Yes, sir. I understand." "Do you?" Michael's voice hardened. "Because I've had employees before who thought they could be friends with the staff. That's not how this works. You maintain distance, you keep them in their lane, and you report anything that seems out of line. If you can't handle that, then you can leave now. Christina felt the familiar sting of invisibility, but beneath it was something else. A recognition that she had seen this pattern before. Wealthy people who built walls so high they forgot how to see the humanity in others, who confused power with worth and money with meaning. She had worked for families like this throughout her adult life, watching as their children grew up cold and distant, as their marriages crumbled under the weight of accumulating assets, but losing their souls. She finished arranging the flowers and moved quietly down the hallway, her mind turning over what she had heard. In her purse was a photograph of Roberto, taken on their wedding day 35 years ago. He was smiling at her with such pure joy, such complete love, that even now it made her heart ache. Roberto had worked construction, his hands always dirty, his back always sore, their bank account always hovering dangerously close to empty. But he had known how to love, how to see the worth in every person he met, how to make their tiny apartment feel like a palace because it was filled with laughter and warmth and the kind of wealth that couldn't be traded on any stock exchange. As Christina made her way to the kitchen to prepare lunch, she wondered if Michael Sterling had ever felt that kind of love. His wife had left him 2 years ago, taking their teenage daughter Elena and moving to California. His older son Marcus lived in New York, running his own hedge fund, but rarely calling home. The house was filled with expensive art and empty rooms, state-of-the-art technology and stony silence. His investments might be performing well, his cryptocurrency portfolio might be soaring, his real estate holdings might be generating passive income that most people could only dream of. But he was as poor as anyone Christina had ever known. The irony wasn't lost on her. She, who took the bus because she couldn't afford a car, who bought generic groceries and shopped at thrift stores, who sent money home to Mexico to help her elderly mother. She was richer in the ways that actually mattered. Her small apartment might not have marble floors or imported fixtures, but it was filled with love letters from Roberto, photographs of family gatherings, the warm smell of café de olla in the mornings. Her wealth was measured in relationships, in memories, in the quiet satisfaction of work done with care and integrity. But she also understood that Michael Sterling's cruelty came from a place of deep pain. She had seen it before in other wealthy employers, the way they wielded their money like a weapon because they were terrified of being vulnerable, of admitting they needed anything they couldn't buy. His dismissive comments about her weren't really about her at all. They were about his own fear of appearing weak, of acknowledging that the woman who mopped his floors might understand something about life that all his financial success had never taught him. As she began preparing his lunch, a simple salad that he would eat alone in his study while monitoring his investment portfolio, Christina thought about Roberto's final words to her. He had been so weak by then, his voice barely a whisper, but he had taken her hand and said, "Christina, mi amor, remember that the richest person in any room is the one who knows how to love." She had carried those words with her through the grief and the financial struggles, through the long days of cleaning houses for people who barely acknowledged her existence. Today, standing in Michael Sterling's pristine kitchen surrounded by appliances worth more than she would earn in 5 years, Christina felt the truth of Roberto's words like a gentle hand on her shoulder. She was the richest person in this house, not because of her bank account or her investment portfolio, both embarrassingly modest, but because she understood something that all of Michael's billions couldn't teach him. She understood that true wealth wasn't about accumulating money or assets or cryptocurrency holdings. It was about the moments of connection, the small kindnesses, the quiet dignity of treating every person with respect regardless of their net worth or their position in some artificial hierarchy. It was about knowing that your worth as a human being had nothing to do with your financial statement and everything to do with the love you carried in your heart. As Christina placed the salad on a silver tray, silver that was probably worth more than her monthly rent, she made a silent promise to Roberto's memory. She would continue to bring warmth to this cold house, not because Michael Sterling deserved it, but because it was who she was. She would continue to treat everyone with kindness, not because it would be appreciated, but because it was the right thing to do. And maybe, just maybe, her quiet example might plant a seed of understanding in the heart of a man who had forgotten that the most valuable things in life could never be traded on any market, could never be stored in any cryptocurrency wallet, could never be quantified in any financial portfolio. The morning sun climbed higher over the Chicago skyline, and Christina carried the lunch tray down the hallway, her footsteps as quiet and steady as her determination to remain true to herself in a world that seemed determined to make her invisible. Christina's day began, as it always did, at 4:30 in the morning with the soft chime of her phone alarm. The small studio apartment in Pilsen was still dark, the city quiet, except for the distant rumble of early delivery trucks making their way through the empty streets. She moved through her morning routine with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been caring for others her entire adult life, a quick shower in the tiny bathroom, coffee made in a pot older than some of Michael Sterling's investment accounts, and a breakfast of toast with honey while she checked the weather on her phone. The commute to the Gold Coast was a journey between worlds, each CTA stop marking her passage from authenticity to artifice, from community to isolation. She boarded the Blue Line at Western Avenue, surrounded by other early morning workers, housekeepers like herself, hospital orderlies heading to their shifts, security guards ending their night duties. These were her people, the invisible army that kept Chicago running while the wealthy slept in their luxury condominiums and counted their stock dividends. During the 40-minute ride, Christina often found herself thinking about the path that had led her to the Sterling mansion. After Roberto's death, she had tried to maintain their little house in back of the yards, taking on extra cleaning jobs and working weekends to make the mortgage payments. But the medical debt from Roberto's cancer treatment had been insurmountable, eating away at their savings like a cancer itself. The house, their dream home, the place where they had planned to grow old together, had to be sold to pay bills that exceeded her annual income. The job at the Sterling residence had come through her cousin Maria, who cleaned houses in Lincoln Park. Maria had heard about the opening from another domestic worker whose employer knew someone who knew someone in Michael Sterling's employ. That was how it worked in their community. A network of women who supported each other, shared information, covered for each other when children were sick or immigration appointments needed to be kept. They were united by the understanding that they were often invisible to their employers, seen only when something went wrong or when their services were no longer needed. The Sterling mansion rose from the Gold Coast like a monument to accumulated wealth, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sun, its windows reflecting the Lake Michigan skyline like mirrors designed to keep the outside world at bay. The building represented more than just expensive real estate. It was a fortress built from stock options and cryptocurrency gains, hedge fund profits, and inherited assets. Every brick had been paid for with money that generated more money, a self-perpetuating cycle of wealth that seemed as foreign to Christina as the moon. She entered through the service entrance as she had been instructed on her first day. The main entrance, with its marble steps and brass fixtures, was reserved for family members and guests whose net worth qualified them for admission to this rarefied world. Christina didn't mind using the back door. She understood the rules of houses like this, the careful hierarchies that kept everyone in their designated place. What mattered to her was not which door she used, but the opportunity to work with dignity and earn the money she needed to maintain her small apartment and send support to her aging mother in Mexico. The service area of the house was a world unto itself, equipped with industrial-grade washing machines, drying rooms for delicate fabrics, and storage areas for cleaning supplies that cost more per bottle than Christina spent on groceries in a week. Everything was arranged with military precision, each item in its designated location, each surface maintained to a standard that would impress hotel inspectors. This was where the real work of maintaining the Sterling fortune's facade happened, invisible to the family members who benefited from it. Mrs. Chen, the head housekeeper, greeted Christina with the brisk professionalism that kept the household running smoothly. Mrs. Chen had worked for wealthy families for over 30 years, climbing from entry-level positions to her current role managing a staff of 8. She understood both the visible and invisible rules of this world, when to speak and when to remain silent, how to maintain professional distance while anticipating every need, how to preserve dignity while accepting that they would always be seen as expendable. "Good morning, Christina," Mrs. Chen said, checking items off her daily list. "Mr. Sterling has a business dinner tonight. 8 guests. Mrs. Patterson will handle the formal dining room. You'll take care of the living areas and the guest bathrooms. He's been particularly demanding lately about everything being perfect." Christina nodded, understanding the subtext. Michael Sterling's mood had been especially dark since his latest investment meeting, something about cryptocurrency market volatility affecting his portfolio's performance. When the wealthy became anxious about their financial holdings, that anxiety inevitably trickled down to their staff in the form of increased scrutiny, impossible standards, and the constant threat that their employment could be terminated at a moment's notice. She began her work in the main living area, a space that showcased Michael Sterling's wealth with the subtlety of a museum exhibition. The furniture had been selected by an interior designer whose fees could have paid Christina's rent for 2 years. Persian rugs, worth more than most people's cars, covered floors made from marble, imported from quarries in Italy. Original paintings by artists whose names Christina didn't recognize, but whose signatures apparently commanded 7-figure prices at auction houses, hung on walls covered in wallpaper that cost more per square foot than most people paid for their entire apartments. But for all its expensive beauty, the room felt completely devoid of human warmth. There were no family photographs, no children's artwork stuck to the refrigerator, no books left open with bookmarks made from grocery store receipts, none of the small personal touches that made a house feel like a home. Instead, everything was perfect in the way that only unlimited money could achieve, and sterile in the way that suggested no one had ever truly lived here. As Christina dusted the intricate details of a sculpture that probably cost more than her late husband's annual salary, she found herself thinking about their own home, the little house they had lost to medical debt. It had been tiny by the Sterling Mansion standards, maybe 1,200 square feet total, but it had been filled with signs of a life actually lived. Roberto's work boots by the front door, her collection of ceramic angels on the kitchen windowsill, the comfortable couch where they had spent countless evenings watching telenovelas and sharing bowls of ice cream. That house had been worth less than one of Michael Sterling's monthly investment portfolio statements, but it had been infinitely richer in the ways that actually mattered. The sound of footsteps on the marble staircase interrupted her thoughts. Michael Sterling appeared in the doorway, dressed in a business suit that probably cost more than Christina earned in 6 months. At 55, he was still handsome in the way that money could preserve and enhance, his hair silver at the temples, his skin maintained by dermatologists and personal trainers whose services were available only to those who could afford them. But his eyes were cold, the kind of cold that came not from lack of feeling, but from too much disappointment, too much betrayal, too many relationships that had been corrupted by the complications of extreme wealth. "Christina," he said, his voice carrying the tone he might use to address a malfunctioning appliance. "There are water spots on the bathroom mirrors. I need them perfect for tonight's guests." "Yes, sir," Christina replied quietly, not looking up from her dusting. "I'll take care of it immediately." "See that you do," he said, already moving toward his study where multiple computer screens tracked his various investments in real time. "And be more careful. Attention to detail is what separates adequate help from excellent help." Christina waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before allowing herself to fully absorb the sting of his words. Not the criticism itself. She had received worse from other employers over the years, but the casual dismissal, the reduction of her entire worth as a human being to her ability to eliminate water spots from bathroom mirrors. She thought about Roberto's hands, always stained with construction mud and concrete dust. Hands that had built homes for other families while barely earning enough to maintain their own. Roberto had never made anyone feel small or insignificant, despite having no college education, no investment portfolio, no cryptocurrency holdings that generated passive income while he slept. She made her way to the master bathroom, a space that resembled a luxury spa more than a functional room. The mirrors were indeed spotted with watermarks, barely visible but apparently unacceptable for someone whose guests would judge him based on the perfection of his domestic arrangements. As she cleaned, Christina caught glimpses of herself in the mirror. A woman in her 60s, her hair showing silver threads she couldn't afford to color. Her hands weathered from years of work that left no trace except in the temporary cleanliness she created. But her eyes, Roberto used to say, her eyes still held the spark that had first attracted him 40 years ago. They held kindness and wisdom and a strength that had survived poverty and loss and the daily indignity of being invisible to people who should have known better. They held the knowledge that her worth was not determined by her employer's opinion, her bank account balance, or her ability to clean mirrors to an impossible standard. As she worked, Christina heard fragments of a phone conversation from Michael Sterling's study. He was discussing investment strategies with someone, his voice animated in a way it never was when he spoke to his employees. "The cryptocurrency market is volatile, but that's where the real money is being made," he was saying. "My portfolio has generated more passive income this quarter than most people see in 5 years. It's all about understanding market psychology, knowing when to buy and when to hold." Christina smiled sadly as she polished the mirror to a spotless shine. Michael Sterling understood market psychology, but had completely failed to understand human psychology. He knew how to generate passive income, but had never learned how to generate genuine connection with another person. He had accumulated financial assets worth hundreds of millions, but had lost the only assets that truly mattered, the love and respect of his own family. She finished cleaning the bathroom and moved on to the guest bedrooms, spaces that were maintained in perfect readiness for visitors who rarely came. The Sterling family's isolation was almost complete now, their wealth having become a barrier to authentic relationship rather than a bridge to deeper connection. His wife had left not because they lacked money, but because they lacked everything money couldn't buy. His children visited only when legal or financial matters required their presence, their conversations stilted and formal, more like business meetings than family gatherings. As the morning progressed, Christina moved through the house like a silent guardian, maintaining its perfection while observing the profound emptiness at its heart. She understood that she was witnessing the paradox of extreme wealth, how the accumulation of money and assets could become so consuming that it crowded out space for love, for vulnerability, for the kind of messy, imperfect humanity that actually made life worth living. Michael Sterling had won at capitalism, but lost at being human. And the tragedy was that he didn't even seem to notice what he had sacrificed in pursuit of ever greater financial returns. By noon, the house gleamed with the kind of perfection that only unlimited money could achieve and maintain. Every surface reflected light like still water, every room arranged with museum-quality precision. But Christina knew that within hours of his guest's departure, The house would return to its usual state of sterile emptiness, its perfection serving no purpose other than to provide Michael Sterling with the illusion that he had control over something in his increasingly isolated life. As she prepared to take her lunch break in the small staff room adjacent to the kitchen, Christina offered a silent prayer for Roberto's soul and for her own strength to continue bringing dignity and grace to a world that seemed determined to strip both away from anyone who couldn't afford to purchase them. The Sterling children arrived that afternoon like reluctant visitors to their own lives, and Christina watched from the margins as the family attempted something resembling normal interaction. Elena Sterling, 16, and beautiful in the way that expensive education and unlimited resources could cultivate, swept through this front door with the entitled confidence of someone who had never had to worry about money but had never learned to find joy in its advantages. Her designer clothes probably cost more than Christina earned in 3 months, but they couldn't disguise the hollow restlessness in her eyes, the boredom that came from having everything and wanting nothing. Marcus Sterling followed an hour later, having flown in from New York for what he had described to his father's secretary as a brief business consultation. At 28, he had inherited his father's sharp intelligence and his mother's refined features, but there was something brittle about him, as if the pressure of living up to the Sterling name and financial legacy had compressed his soul into something hard and impermeable. His hedge fund was performing well. Christina had overheard enough phone conversations to understand that he was making his own fortune in cryptocurrency and emerging markets. But success had not brought him happiness, only more responsibilities and higher stakes. The dinner party was scheduled for 7 o'clock, and the house buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that preceded any event where Michael Sterling's reputation and financial standing would be on display. The caterers arrived with ingredients that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, transforming the kitchen into a temporary restaurant kitchen where every dish would be crafted to impress guests whose own wealth made them difficult to surprise or delight. Christina's role during these events was to remain invisible while ensuring that everything behind the scenes ran flawlessly. She monitored the guest bathrooms, replaced hand towels the moment they showed any sign of use, and maintained the perfect emptiness of rooms that guests might glimpse but not enter. It was delicate work, being present enough to anticipate needs while remaining absent enough to preserve the illusion that the Sterling household maintained its perfection through some kind of effortless magic. The guests arrived in a parade of luxury vehicles that probably represented more accumulated wealth than entire neighborhoods possessed. Chicago's financial elite, each arrival announced by the doorman with the kind of reverential tone usually reserved for heads of state. These were people whose investment portfolios generated more passive income in a month than most families earned in a year, whose cryptocurrency holdings fluctuated by amounts that could buy houses, whose stock options and hedge fund returns allowed them to live in a stratosphere of wealth that existed completely separate from the economy experienced by ordinary people. Mrs. Patterson, the head server, directed the evening's choreography with military precision, ensuring that drinks appeared at the exact moment they were needed, that conversations were never interrupted by the mundane necessities of human service. Christina watched from the service areas as the guests moved through the Sterling mansion like beings from another species, their concerns and conversations centered entirely around investment strategies, market predictions, and the complex game of accumulating ever greater amounts of money while minimizing tax obligations and maximizing returns. "The opportunity in cryptocurrency is unprecedented," she heard one guest saying to Michael as they moved from the living room toward the dining room. "My portfolio has tripled this year alone. It's like finding oil in your backyard, except the oil keeps regenerating itself." Michael nodded, with the satisfaction of someone whose own cryptocurrency investments had performed even better. "The key is understanding that we're not just investing in digital assets," he replied. "We're investing in the future of wealth itself. Traditional banking, traditional investment vehicles, they're becoming obsolete. The real money is being made by people who understand that the entire financial system is being rebuilt from the ground up." Christina continued her work, moving like a ghost through the mansion's service corridors, but she found herself thinking about the profound disconnect between these conversations and the reality of most people's financial lives. Her own relationship with money was straightforward and immediate. She earned barely enough to cover her basic expenses, sent what she could to her mother in Mexico, and lived with the constant awareness that a single unexpected expense could destabilize her entire economic situation. The idea of having so much money that it could generate more money without any effort from her was as foreign as space travel. Yet, as she listened to fragments of conversation throughout the evening, Christina began to understand something that perhaps the wealthy guests themselves had lost sight of. Their obsession with accumulating financial assets had become divorced from any connection to actual human needs or desires. They spoke about money as if it were an abstract game, a scorecard for measuring success that had nothing to do with improving their lives or the lives of anyone around them. The pursuit of wealth had become its own end, rather than a means to any meaningful purpose. During a brief lull in service, Christina found herself in the kitchen helping Mrs. Patterson coordinate the dessert course. Through the serving window, she could observe the dinner party guests as they enjoyed their meal at Michael Sterling's mahogany dining table, surrounded by artwork worth more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. But despite the expensive food, the premium wine, and the opulent surroundings, there was something joyless about their gathering, something that reminded Christina of a business meeting rather than a social celebration. The conversations continued to revolve around investment strategies and market predictions, each guest attempting to showcase their financial acumen while gathering intelligence about opportunities they might have missed. They spoke in code, references to portfolio diversification and alternative asset allocation, and cryptocurrency mining operations that excluded anyone who lacked their specialized knowledge and vast resources. It was a language designed to reinforce their separation from the ordinary world, their membership in an exclusive club defined not by shared values or genuine friendship, but by the size of their investment accounts. "Michael, you must tell us about your new acquisition," one guest was saying as Christina replaced water glasses that were already full, but somehow slightly imperfect. "I heard you purchased that property development in River North." Michael smiled with the satisfaction of someone accustomed to being envied for his financial achievements. "It's generating excellent passive income," he replied. "The luxury condominium market in Chicago is booming. Between the rental income and the projected appreciation, my return on investment should exceed 20% annually." Christina thought about River North, the neighborhood where her cousin Maria cleaned offices in the evening after her day job ended. Maria had told her about the luxury developments going up there, buildings that were converting affordable housing into expensive condominiums, displacing longtime residents who couldn't afford the rising rents. Michael Sterling's investment success meant that families like hers were being pushed further from the city center, forced to endure longer commutes and higher transportation costs, while their old neighborhoods became playgrounds for the wealthy. But this connection between his profits and other people's displacement was invisible to Michael and his guests, their wealth insulating them from any awareness of the human cost of their financial success. They lived in an atmosphere so rarefied that they had lost touch with the reality that most people experienced, where money was not an abstract scorekeeping system, but the difference between security and vulnerability, between having a home and losing it to medical debt or rent, increases. As the evening progressed, Christina noticed something else about the Sterling family dynamics that made her heart ache with recognition. Elena and Marcus participated in the dinner conversation, but there was something performative about their interactions with their father, as if they were playing roles rather than expressing genuine thoughts or feelings. Their relationship seemed to be mediated entirely through discussions of money. Elena's expensive education, Marcus's hedge fund performance, their mother's financial settlement after the divorce. There was no warmth, no personal connection, no evidence of the kind of love that had filled Christina's much smaller home during her happiest years with Roberto. The Sterling family had everything money could buy, but they had somehow forgotten how to simply enjoy each other's company, how to find pleasure in ordinary conversation, how to express affection in ways that couldn't be quantified on a financial statement. By 10 o'clock, the guests had departed in their luxury vehicles, leaving behind the kind of satisfied exhaustion that came from a successful performance rather than genuine enjoyment. The caterers packed up their equipment with practiced efficiency, the servers counted their generous tips, and the house began its return to the usual state of perfect emptiness that characterized the Sterling family's daily existence. Christina worked until nearly midnight, ensuring that every trace of the evening's event was erased, that the house would greet Michael Sterling the next morning in its customary state of museum-quality perfection. But as she finally gathered her things to leave, she found herself thinking about the profound loneliness that seemed to permeate this beautiful mansion. The way that unlimited wealth had somehow created unlimited isolation for the people who possessed it. The ride home on the late-night CTA was quiet, the train carrying night shift workers and service industry employees back to neighborhoods where money was scarce, but human connection was still possible. Christina looked out the window at the city lights and thought about Roberto, about their tiny house that had been worth so little in financial terms, but had contained everything that actually mattered. She wondered if Michael Sterling would ever understand what he had traded away in his pursuit of ever greater wealth, whether he would realize that the richest portfolio in the world was worthless without someone to share it with who loved you for reasons that had nothing to do with your net worth. As the train pulled into the Western Avenue station, Christina offered another silent prayer, not for money or material comfort, but for the strength to continue serving with dignity in a world that had confused accumulation with achievement, wealth with worth, financial success with human value. Something shifted in the Sterling household the following morning, though Christina couldn't have anticipated it when she arrived at her usual time to find Elena Sterling sitting alone in the kitchen, still wearing her school uniform at nearly 10 o'clock. The girls' expensive private school started at 8, and Elena was never late. Her father's expectations demanded the kind of rigid punctuality that reflected well on the Sterling family's reputation for excellence in all things. But today, Elena sat at the granite kitchen island with her school bag untouched beside her, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at Lake Michigan with the kind of vacant expression that suggested she was seeing something much farther away than the Chicago shoreline. Her long dark hair, usually styled with the care that came from having access to the city's most expensive salons, hung loose around her shoulders, and there were shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't entirely conceal. Christina had learned over her months of employment that the Sterling family members rarely acknowledged her presence unless they needed something specific, so she was surprised when Elena turned to look at her directly as she entered the kitchen to begin her morning cleaning routine. "Christina," Elena said, her voice carrying an exhaustion that seemed far too mature for her 16 years. "Can I ask you something?" The question itself was unprecedented. In all her months working in the Sterling household, none of the family members had ever requested Christina's opinion on anything, had never suggested that her thoughts or experiences might be worth hearing. She set down her cleaning supplies and gave Elena her full attention, recognizing something in the girl's expression that reminded her of her own daughter at that age, when the world began to reveal its complications and disappointments. "Of course, mija," Christina said gently, using the term of endearment that came naturally to her, despite the formal distance usually maintained in houses like this. Elena was quiet for a moment, as if trying to find words for something she couldn't quite articulate. Finally, she said, "Do you think it's possible to have everything and still feel like you have nothing?" The question hung in the air between them, profound in its simplicity and heartbreaking in its vulnerability. Christina recognized it as the kind of question that could only be asked by someone who had grown up surrounded by material abundance, but was beginning to understand that wealth and happiness were not synonymous, that money could purchase comfort and security but could not fill the deeper human needs for connection and purpose and authentic love. Christina pulled out one of the kitchen stools and sat across from Elena, a breach of household protocol that would have horrified Mrs. Chen, but felt necessary in this moment of unexpected honesty. "I think," Christina said carefully, "that we live in a world that confuses having things with being happy. Your father has built something impressive, like all that money, the investments, the success. But I've worked for wealthy families before, and I've learned that the people with the most money are sometimes the loneliest people I've ever met." Elena nodded slowly, thinking about her daily commute on the CTA, the way that public transportation forced people to slow down, to observe the world around them, to share space with strangers from different economic circumstances. "Roberto and I used to take the train to visit his family in Missouri," she said. "We couldn't afford to fly, but we discovered that we actually preferred the slower journey. It gave us time to talk, to watch the landscape change, to appreciate the distance we were traveling." Michael Sterling listened with the attention of someone who was beginning to understand that experiences he had dismissed as inconvenient or inefficient might actually contain wisdom he had missed in his rush toward greater wealth and status. "When did you know that money wasn't the most important thing?" he asked. "When did you learn to prioritize relationship over financial success?" The question revealed his assumption that poverty had somehow made Christina wise, that her lack of wealth had naturally led to better life priorities. But Christina understood that wisdom came from experience rather than economic circumstances, that plenty of poor people made the same mistakes about values and relationships that wealthy people made, just with different resources. "I learned it gradually," Christina said thoughtfully. "When Roberto was sick, we spent every dollar we had trying to keep him alive. We sold our house, emptied our savings, borrowed money from family. We would have done anything to buy more time together. But in the end, the money didn't matter. What mattered was the love we shared, the way we cared for each other, the memories we had created together." Michael Sterling was quiet for several minutes, processing Christina's perspective on the relationship between money and meaning. "I've been so afraid of not having enough," he finally said, "that I forgot to pay attention to what I already had. I was so focused on building wealth that I didn't notice my wife leaving, my children growing up without me, my son pushing himself toward collapse trying to earn my approval. The admission was painful but necessary. A recognition that his fear of financial insecurity had created emotional insecurity for everyone around him, that his success had come at the cost of the relationships that should have been his primary motivation for achieving financial stability. Christina thought about Elena's earlier questions about happiness and success, her intuitive understanding that her family's wealth had not translated into well-being. "Fear makes us do strange things," she said gently. "When we're afraid of losing what we have, sometimes we hold on to it so tightly that we crush it. Love requires some faith, some willingness to be vulnerable." Michael Sterling nodded, beginning to understand that his approach to relationships had been influenced by the same concerns about risk management that governed his investment strategies. He had tried to control outcomes, to minimize emotional exposure, to protect himself from the kind of losses that couldn't be recovered through financial planning. As the train traveled through Indiana and into Ohio, their conversation deepened, moving from general observations about money and relationships to more personal revelations about their individual experiences of love and loss. Michael Sterling talked about his marriage, how his wife had gradually become more like a business partner than a romantic companion, how their conversations had eventually consisted entirely of logistics and financial planning, rather than dreams or feelings or daily observations about their shared life. "I thought I was being responsible," he said, "providing for my family's future, ensuring that we would never face financial hardship. But I was so focused on future security that I missed the present happiness that was available to us." Christina understood the tragic irony of his situation, that his efforts to protect his family's future had destroyed their present, that his success in accumulating wealth had coincided with his failure to accumulate the experiences and memories that actually created lasting security and satisfaction. "Roberto used to say that the present is the only time we can actually love someone," Christina shared. "The past is memory, the future is hope, but love happens in the moment when you choose to pay attention to the person in front of you." The wisdom of Roberto's words seemed to resonate with Michael Sterling, offering him a framework for understanding what he had missed in his rush toward future achievement. "How do I learn to do that?" he asked. "How do I learn to be present instead of always thinking 3 steps ahead?" Christina looked out the window at the passing countryside, thinking about her own journey from devastation to acceptance, the long process of learning to carry grief without being crushed by it, to remain open to love despite the certainty of eventual loss. "You practice," she said simply. "You start by really listening when your children talk to you, instead of thinking about how their words relate to your plans for them. You ask them questions about their feelings instead of only asking about their achievements. You tell them you love them not because they're successful, but because they're yours." Michael Sterling was taking notes on his phone as Christina spoke, treating her advice like the valuable business intelligence he was accustomed to receiving from expensive consultants. But Christina gently asked him to put the phone away, to practice the kind of presence she was describing, by giving his full attention to their conversation without the mediation of technology. The gesture seemed to surprise him, the request that he engage with her words without simultaneously managing other priorities. But as the afternoon progressed, Christina watched him gradually relax into the rhythm of uninterrupted conversation, discovering perhaps, for the first time in years, what it felt like to focus completely on the person sitting in front of him. By the time the train pulled into Penn Station, something had shifted between them. They were no longer employer and employee, wealthy man and working woman, billionaire and domestic staff member. They were 2 people who had each learned hard lessons about love and loss, who were committed to helping a family heal from the damage caused by confusing financial success with human worth. As they took a taxi to the hospital where Marcus Sterling was recovering, Christina felt that this journey represented more than just a geographical movement from Chicago to New York. It was a passage from one understanding of wealth to another, from accumulation to connection, from success measured by portfolio performance to success measured by the health of relationships that couldn't be quantified on any financial statement but mattered more than any investment return. The hospital room was quiet when they arrived. Elena sitting beside Marcus's bed, reading aloud from a book of poetry, her voice soft and steady as she shared verses that had nothing to do with business or finance or the accumulation of wealth. Marcus looked fragile against the white hospital bedding, his usual corporate intensity replaced by the kind of vulnerability that serious illness brings, the recognition that all human achievement is temporary and fragile. When Michael Sterling entered the room, both of his children looked up with expressions that mixed hope and wariness, uncertain whether their father had come to manage the crisis or to genuinely participate in his son's healing. But instead of immediately taking charge of the situation, instead of asking about medical reports or discharge planning or business continuity, Michael Sterling simply walked to his son's bedside and took his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying more emotion than Christina had ever heard from him. "I'm sorry that I made you think your worth depended on your professional success. I'm sorry that I taught you to measure yourself by the size of your portfolio instead of the size of your heart." The words seemed to break something open in Marcus, tears flowing freely as he finally heard his father acknowledge what he had always suspected, that their relationship had been built on performance rather than love, on achievement rather than acceptance. Helena moved to embrace both her father and brother, creating a circle of connection that felt entirely different from the formal family interactions Christina had observed in the Sterling mansion. Christina stood quietly in the corner of the room, witnessing a transformation that no amount of money could have purchased, watching a family learn to choose love over fear, presence over performance, relationship over accumulation. She thought about Roberto's belief that love was the only wealth that truly mattered, grateful that she had lived long enough to see his wisdom validated in the healing of a family who had almost lost each other to the pursuit of financial success. As afternoon gave way to evening, and the Sterling family continued their process of reconnection and healing, Christina felt that her presence in their lives had served a purpose she could never have anticipated when she first took the job cleaning their mansion. She had helped them remember what Roberto had always known, that the richest life was the life most full of love, and that no amount of money could compensate for the poverty of relationships that were based on anything other than genuine care for each other's well-being and happiness. The healing that began in that New York hospital room continued over the following months, but it was not the linear progression that Michael Sterling might have expected from his business experience. Recovery from emotional and relationship damage required patience, forgiveness, and the kind of daily commitment that couldn't be accelerated through financial resources or strategic planning. It meant learning new ways of communicating, new ways of showing care, new ways of finding meaning that didn't depend on accumulating more wealth or achieving greater professional status. Marcus remained in New York for several additional weeks, but instead of rushing back to his hedge fund responsibilities, he used the time to reassess his life priorities with the kind of thorough analysis he had previously applied only to investment opportunities. Elena delayed her college applications to spend time with her brother, and Michael Sterling made the unprecedented decision to delegate significant business responsibilities to trusted associates so he could be present for his family during this critical period. Christina found herself in the unexpected role of family counselor and wisdom keeper, her perspective sought and valued by people who were discovering that her experience of loss and recovery had prepared her to guide them through their own process of healing and transformation. The irony was not lost on her. A woman whose husband had died partly because they couldn't afford adequate health care was now helping a family whose resources could purchase the finest medical treatment, but who had nearly lost each other to emotional poverty. The Sterling mansion, when they all returned to Chicago, felt different. The same expensive furniture and artwork remained, but the atmosphere had changed from sterile perfection to something warmer and more human. Family meals became regular occurrences, not formal affairs, focused on business discussion, but genuine opportunities for connection and conversation about topics that mattered to each person as an individual, rather than as a component of the Sterling financial empire. Elena ultimately chose to study psychology, and Michael Sterling not only accepted her decision, but funded a scholarship program for students from low-income families who wanted to pursue careers in mental health and counseling. Marcus restructured his investment firm to focus on socially responsible investing, using his financial expertise to generate profits while supporting companies that prioritized worker welfare and environmental sustainability over pure profit maximization. But perhaps the most significant change was in Michael Sterling himself. He began volunteering at a community center in Christina's neighborhood, teaching financial literacy classes to working families who were struggling to build economic security. His wealth and expertise, applied in service of others, rather than simply for accumulating more wealth, created the kind of meaning and purpose that had been missing from his previous success. Christina continued working for the Sterling family, but her role evolved into something closer to family friend than domestic employee. Her wisdom and perspective became valued resources, her presence a reminder that the most important wealth was the wealth of relationship and community and shared humanity that transcended economic differences. One evening, as Christina prepared dinner in the Sterling kitchen, not because she was required to do so, but because cooking for people she cared about brought her joy, Elena found her humming an old Mexican song that Roberto used to sing during their evening meal preparations. "Christina," Elena said, settling onto one of the kitchen stools that had become her favorite spot for their ongoing conversations. "I've been thinking about something you said months ago about how happiness comes from relationships rather than money. I'm starting to understand what you meant." Christina looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, noting the contentment in Elena's expression, the way the girl's face had softened and brightened as her family had learned to prioritize love over financial achievement. "Tell me what you've learned," Christina said encouragingly. "I used to think that having money made us special," Elena said thoughtfully. "I thought it meant we were better than people who had less, that our wealth proved we were somehow more valuable or deserving. But now I see that money is just a tool, and like any tool, it can be used to build something good or to tear something down." The observation revealed Elena's growing maturity, her understanding that wealth carried responsibility rather than simply privilege, that financial resources could either isolate people from human connection or facilitate deeper engagement with community and service to others. "Your father is learning the same lesson," Christina said. "It's never too late to change our relationship with money, to decide that we want to use our resources to create more love in the world rather than more isolation." Elena nodded, processing the connection between individual transformation and social impact. "Marcus told me something interesting yesterday," she continued. He said that when he was focused only on making money, every day felt empty, like he was running on a treadmill that never went anywhere. But now that he's using his work to help other people build financial security, every day feels meaningful. Christina smiled at the recognition that meaningful work was possible, even within the financial industry. That the problem had never been money itself, but the confusion of money as an end, rather than as a means to serving human flourishing and community well-being. Michael Sterling appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the sounds of conversation and the aroma of Christina's cooking. Over the past months, he had become comfortable participating in these informal family gatherings, discovering that some of the most valuable conversations happened during meal preparation, rather than in formal business meetings. "Christina," he said, settling into his own customary spot at the kitchen island, "I had lunch today with one of my investors, someone whose portfolio I've been managing for over 10 years. He asked me what had changed about my approach to wealth management, said he could see a difference in my recommendations and priorities." Christina paused in her cooking, recognizing that Michael Sterling was sharing something important about his own transformation, his integration of new values into his professional identity. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him that I had learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy," Michael replied. "Rich is about having money. Wealthy is about having a life that feels worth living, relationships that bring joy, work that serves purposes beyond just accumulation." The distinction revealed how thoroughly Michael Sterling's understanding of success had been transformed. His recognition that financial achievement without human connection was actually a form of poverty, that true wealth required the kind of emotional and spiritual resources that couldn't be traded on any market. "And what was his response?" Elena asked, curious about whether other people in her father's business circle were ready for similar transformation. Michael Sterling smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered that authenticity was more rewarding than performance. "He asked me to teach him," he said. "He's been successful by financial measures for decades, but he's starting to realize that success and happiness are not synonymous. He wants to learn how to find meaning in his work and his relationships." The conversation continued as they shared the meal Christina had prepared, but the significance went beyond the specific words exchanged. They were demonstrating a different way of being wealthy, a different understanding of what success could look like when it was grounded in love rather than fear, service rather than accumulation, connection rather than isolation. As the evening wound down and the Sterling family settled into their individual activities, Elena working on college essays about using psychology to help underserved communities, Marcus reviewing investment proposals from companies focused on social impact, Michael Sterling reading books about finding meaning and purpose in professional life, Christina reflected on the profound transformation she had witnessed. The Sterling family had not become less wealthy in financial terms. Their investment portfolios continued to generate substantial returns. Their properties continued to appreciate. Their lifestyle continued to reflect significant economic privilege. But they had learned to use their wealth differently, to see their resources as tools for creating connection and meaning, rather than simply for accumulating more resources. More importantly, they had discovered that the most valuable forms of wealth, love, purpose, community, service to others, were available to everyone regardless of their financial circumstances. Christina's own life, with its modest income and simple pleasures, had served as a reminder that happiness and fulfillment came from sources that couldn't be purchased or traded or stored in investment accounts. As she prepared to leave the Sterling mansion that evening, returning to her small apartment in Pilsen, where she would call her mother in Mexico and pray for Roberto's soul and plan her modest activities for the next day, Christina felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to witness and participate in such profound human transformation. The Sterling family had learned Roberto's great lesson, that love was the only wealth that truly mattered. And in teaching them, Christina had honored her husband's memory while discovering that her own wisdom and experience had value that transcended any financial compensation. She had helped heal a family, and in doing so, had found her own form of wealth that no economic hardship could ever take away. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late spring, delivered not by the usual postal service, but by Michael Sterling's personal attorney, who had driven to Christina's apartment in Pilsen to ensure she received it personally. Christina opened the heavy envelope with trembling fingers, recognizing the formal letterhead of Sterling Financial, but uncertain what business the company might have with her. The contents took several readings to fully comprehend. In elegant legal language, the document explained that Michael Sterling had established a foundation dedicated to supporting working families facing medical crises, and that he had named Christina Martinez as the foundation's first program director, with an annual salary that exceeded her lifetime earnings from domestic work. But more than the financial offer, generous though it was, the letter contained a personal note in Michael Sterling's own handwriting that brought tears to her eyes. "Dear Christina, you taught us that the greatest wealth comes from loving service to others. We would be honored if you would help us use our financial resources to extend that kind of love to families who are facing the same challenges you faced when Roberto was ill. Your wisdom guided our family through darkness into light. We hope you will allow us to share that wisdom with others who need to know that they are not alone in their struggles. The offer represented more than just employment. It was recognition that Christina's experience of love and loss, her understanding of dignity in the face of hardship, her ability to remain compassionate despite being invisible to wealthy employers, all of this constituted a form of expertise that was valuable beyond any traditional measure. Christina sat in her small kitchen, reading the letter again while morning light filtered through windows overlooking the neighborhood where she had rebuilt her life after Roberto's death. The irony was profound. She who had lost her home to medical debt would now help others avoid the same fate. She who had been treated as invisible by the wealthy would now advocate for working families who faced similar dismissal. That afternoon, she returned to the Sterling mansion for what would be her final day as a domestic employee, and her first day as something entirely different. The family gathered in the living room, where she had once dusted furniture worth more than her annual income. But now they sat together as equals, as people who had learned that human worth had nothing to do with bank account balances or social position. "Christina," Michael Sterling said, his voice carrying a humility that would have been unimaginable during her first months of employment, "you gave us the greatest gift anyone has ever given us. You gave us back to ourselves, helped us remember what actually matters in life." Elena, now preparing for college with excitement about studying psychology and working with underserved communities, added, "You showed us that taking care of people isn't just a job, it's the most important work anyone can do." Marcus, whose hedge fund now focused exclusively on investments that created social benefit alongside financial returns, nodded in agreement. "You taught us that success means using whatever advantages we have to lift other people up, not just to accumulate more advantages for ourselves." Christina looked around the room where she had once felt invisible, now seeing faces filled with genuine affection and respect, people who had learned to value her not for the services she provided, but for the wisdom she carried, the love she embodied, the strength she had developed through surviving loss with grace. "I want to tell you a story," Christina said, settling into the chair where she now belonged as a full participant rather than a silent observer. "Roberto used to say that love is like water. It's most powerful when it flows, when it moves from person to person, when it doesn't get trapped in one place. You all learn to let love flow through your lives, to use your wealth like water that nourishes everything it touches." The metaphor captured something essential about their transformation, how their money had changed from a dam that blocked emotional connection to a river that carried love and service and healing to places where it was desperately needed. They had learned Roberto's lesson not just intellectually, but practically, using their resources to create the kind of loving community that he and Christina had shared in their modest home. Over the following months, Christina threw herself into her new role with the passion of someone who had found work that aligned perfectly with her values and experience. The Sterling Foundation's programs grew rapidly, providing not just financial assistance to families facing medical crises, but also the kind of emotional support and advocacy that Christina knew from her own experience was equally essential. She hired other women like herself, domestic workers, caregivers, service industry employees, who understood hardship from the inside rather than observing it from a distance. Together, they created a network of support that addressed not just the practical aspects of financial crisis, but the dignity and emotional needs of families who were struggling to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming circumstances. The Foundation's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. Treat people facing crisis as complete human beings worthy of respect and care, not as problems to be solved or statistics to be managed. Provide financial assistance without judgment, emotional support without condescension, advocacy without paternalism. Trust that people in crisis often know what they need better than well-meaning outsiders who have never faced similar challenges. Christina's annual salary allowed her to move from her studio apartment to a small house in the same neighborhood, close enough to maintain her community connections, but comfortable enough to reflect her new professional status. But more importantly, her work provided the kind of meaning and purpose that she had always found in caring for others, now magnified through resources that could reach families throughout the Chicago area. 6 months after accepting the foundation position, Christina received a phone call that brought her full circle in ways she could never have anticipated. Maria, her cousin, who had first told her about the cleaning position at the Sterling mansion, was calling with desperation in her voice. "Christina, mi amor, I need help," Maria said through tears. "My grandson David is in the hospital with leukemia, and the insurance won't cover the specialized treatment he needs. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills, and we're already behind on the mortgage, because I've been missing work to be with him." The situation was heartbreakingly familiar. Exactly the kind of crisis that had destroyed Christina's own financial security when Roberto was ill, the impossible choice between adequate medical care and economic survival that faced too many working families without adequate health insurance or sufficient savings. But this time, Christina was not powerless. This time, she had resources and expertise and institutional support to offer comprehensive help that addressed both the immediate financial need and the long-term stability of Maria's family. "Maria," Christina said firmly, "you're not alone. We're going to take care of David's medical expenses, and we're going to make sure your family doesn't lose your house. But more than that, we're going to make sure you have support through every step of this process. People who understand what you're going through, because we've been there ourselves." The phone call launched Christina into the kind of advocacy work that drew on every aspect of her life experience: negotiating with hospital billing departments, coordinating with social workers, connecting Maria's family with support groups, ensuring that they maintained their dignity while receiving the assistance they needed. But perhaps most importantly, Christina was able to offer Maria something she had never received during her own crisis: the complete attention and care of someone who understood that medical emergencies were about much more than money, that families in crisis needed emotional support and practical advocacy as much as they needed financial assistance. Working with Maria's family reminded Christina of Roberto's enduring wisdom about love flowing like water, reaching the places where it was most needed, connecting people across differences of circumstance and background through shared humanity and mutual care. The Sterling Foundation had become a river system, channeling resources and love and hope to families who might otherwise have drowned in circumstances beyond their control. 1 year after accepting her position with the foundation, Christina was invited to speak at a conference of wealthy philanthropists about effective approaches to addressing medical debt and family financial crises. Standing before an audience of people whose combined wealth exceeded the GDP of small nations, Christina thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I want to tell you about the difference between charity and love," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had experienced both giving and receiving help. "Charity is when wealthy people write checks to make themselves feel better about inequality. Love is when people with resources get close enough to people in crisis to understand their complete humanity, to see them not as problems to be solved, but as neighbors to be supported." The presentation drew on everything she had learned during her time with the Sterling family: how authentic transformation required relationship rather than just resource transfer, how healing required presence and dignity as much as financial assistance, how people in crisis needed advocates who understood their circumstances rather than well-meaning strangers who observed their struggles from a comfortable distance. "The families we serve don't need our pity," Christina continued. "They need our respect. They don't need us to solve their problems for them. They need us to provide resources and support so they can solve their own problems with dignity. They don't need charity that makes them feel small. They need love that helps them feel human." After her presentation, several philanthropists approached Christina with questions about how to restructure their own giving to reflect the values she had described. But one conversation stood out among the rest: a young woman whose family had built their wealth through technology investments, who spoke about feeling isolated and directionless despite having access to unlimited financial resources. "I want my life to matter the way yours does," the young woman said with genuine longing. "I want to feel like my wealth is connected to something meaningful, like I'm contributing to healing rather than just accumulating more money." Christina recognized the woman's questions as similar to those Elena Sterling had asked months earlier, the search for purpose and meaning that went beyond financial achievement. "Start by getting close to one family," she advised. "Don't try to solve poverty or eliminate medical debt for everyone. Just choose one family and learn their story, understand their challenges, figure out how to support their strengths rather than just addressing their needs." The advice seemed to resonate, and Christina found herself becoming an informal mentor to several young, wealthy individuals who were seeking ways to use their resources for genuine service rather than just philanthropic recognition. She was helping to create a new generation of wealthy people who understood Roberto's wisdom about love flowing like water, who saw their financial advantages as opportunities to facilitate healing and connection, rather than to maintain separation and superiority. As Christina's second year with the Sterling Foundation progressed, she often reflected on the profound transformation she had witnessed and participated in. Her own journey from invisible domestic worker to respected advocate and mentor. The Sterling family's journey from isolated wealth to meaningful service. The ripple effects of choosing love over fear that continue to spread through their community and beyond. The work was demanding and emotionally complex, requiring her to navigate the intersection of money and healing, privilege and suffering, individual transformation and systemic change. But it was also deeply fulfilling in ways that her previous employment could never have been, because it allowed her to honor Roberto's memory while extending his wisdom about love and dignity to people who desperately needed both. Late one evening, As Christina reviewed applications for foundation assistance, she came across a case that stopped her completely. A woman whose husband was dying of the same cancer that had killed Roberto, facing the same impossible choice between adequate care and financial survival that had destroyed Christina's own economic security. As she read the application, the desperate hope mixed with resigned despair, the careful documentation of medical expenses and insurance denials, the proud reluctance to ask for help, Christina felt Roberto's presence as clearly as if he were sitting beside her in the foundation office, his voice reminding her that love was indeed like water, flowing from person to person, carrying healing to places where it was most needed. The next morning, Christina would call this woman and offer not just financial assistance, but the complete support of someone who had walked the same path, who understood that medical crisis threatened dignity and hope as much as it threatened economic security. She would offer love disguised as professional service, Roberto's wisdom channeled through institutional resources, proof that the wealthy could learn to use their advantages to create more love in the world rather than more separation. As Christina locked the foundation office and walked to her car, she offered a prayer of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this work, for the Sterling family's willingness to learn and change, for Roberto's enduring wisdom about what wealth actually meant. She had learned that the richest life was indeed the life most full of love, and she was privileged to spend her days helping others discover the same truth. The story that had begun with invisible domestic work in a cold mansion had become something larger and more beautiful, a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, service over accumulation, connection over isolation. Christina had found her true wealth in the opportunity to extend Roberto's legacy of love to people who needed to know that they were not alone, that their dignity mattered, that love was still possible even in their darkest moments, and in giving that gift to others, she had received the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that her life had meaning beyond any measure, that her love would continue flowing long after she was gone, reaching people she would never meet, carrying Roberto's wisdom into a future filled with hope. On a clear autumn morning, exactly 3 years after Christina Martinez first walked through the service entrance of the Sterling mansion, she stood before a gathering of families whose lives had been transformed by the Foundation's work. The event was being held not in some luxury hotel ballroom, but in the community center in Pilsen, where Michael Sterling now taught financial literacy classes, surrounded by the warmth and energy of the neighborhood that had sustained Christina through her darkest hours. The families present represented dozens of medical crises that had been met with comprehensive support, not just financial assistance, but advocacy, emotional care, and the kind of dignified treatment that recognized their complete humanity. Children who might have gone without necessary treatment were healthy and thriving. Parents who might have lost their homes to medical debt were maintaining stability while recovering from illness. Families who might have faced crisis alone had found community and hope. But perhaps more significantly, the gathering also included members of the Sterling family and several other wealthy individuals who had learned to use their resources for genuine service rather than mere charity. They sat side by side with working families, not as benefactors dispensing aid to grateful recipients, but as neighbors sharing stories and learning from each other's experiences. Christina looked out at the crowd and saw Roberto's vision of love flowing like water made manifest. Connections across difference, healing that moved in multiple directions, wealth that enriched everyone it touched rather than concentrating in isolated pools. The Foundation had become much more than a program providing financial assistance. It had become a community where people discovered their shared humanity despite different economic circumstances. Elena Sterling, now a college sophomore, studying psychology with a focus on trauma and resilience, was documenting the event for a research project about the effectiveness of dignity-based approaches to social service. But Christina could see that Elena's academic interest was secondary to her genuine care for the families she was interviewing, her ability to connect with people across differences of background and experience. "Christina," Elena said during a quiet moment between interviews, "I wanted to thank you for teaching me that service isn't something you do from above, looking down at people who need help. Real service means getting close enough to people to understand their strengths, not just their needs." The comment reflected Elena's growing sophistication about the dynamics of helping relationships, her understanding that effective assistance required humility and respect rather than just resources and good intentions. She was becoming the kind of psychologist who would honor her clients' dignity while supporting their healing, who would use her advantages to facilitate others' growth rather than to maintain hierarchical power relationships. Marcus Sterling was also present at the gathering, having restructured his entire financial practice around the principles of social responsibility and community impact. His investment firm now specialized in funding businesses and initiatives that strengthened working-class communities, generating both financial returns for investors and social benefits for people who had historically been excluded from wealth-building opportunities. The most successful investments are the ones that create value for everyone involved, Marcus explained to a group of community members who were curious about his work. When we invest in businesses that pay living wages, support worker organizing, and contribute to community development, everyone benefits: investors, workers, and neighborhoods. His approach represented a fundamental reimagining of how finance could operate, moving beyond the zero-sum thinking that required some people to lose in order for others to win, toward collaborative models that recognized interdependence